Protests may have ousted Algeria's president, but will they also take down his successors? We debate if new demonstrations can lead to a complete overhaul of the government. I'm Imran Garta, and today's newsmaker is Algeria's revolutionary standoff. Political unrest in Algeria has turned into a game of attrition. On one side are the cronies of former President Abdelaziz Bouteflika, who are losing their jobs, or worse. And on the other side are the protesters, who continue to fill the city's streets. But for how long? Activists pushing to overhaul the entire government seem to be winning this game for now. The President of the Supreme Court and his deputy have been sacked. The former Prime Minister is among a dozen senior officials being investigated for corruption. Even Bouteflika's own brother has lost his job after 37 years in government. But that government is still being run by two Bouteflika appointees. And while elections have been postponed to make way for real candidates, Bouteflika's allies remain at the helm. With more on all of this, here's Adam Pletz.
Abdelaziz Bouteflika resigned as Algeria's president on April the 2nd. But it wasn't enough to quell public disaffection that has now lasted for 16 weeks.
We want to set our country free. They have wronged us. They have disgraced us. This is the rule of the disgraceful. This is the rule of the mafia.
The protesters want to see the removal of what they view as a corrupt elite, composed not only of politicians, but also military officers and powerful business leaders.
I think that the people need to demand a lot more. That's why we're still here today.
Much of the opposition believes Bouteflika, whose health is failing, was simply a figurehead. And they don't think much of his replacements, the interim president, Abdelkader Ben Salah, and Prime Minister, Noureddine Bedawi, who was appointed in one of Bouteflika's last acts. But the way forward is unclear. Algeria's Constitutional Council cancelled elections that were scheduled for early July. The only two candidates, who were previously unknown to the public, were rejected by the council, with none of the major parties having opted to seriously contest the election. Ben Salah has been told by the council to organise another election, but no date has been set, and until then, he said he'll stay in power. Sitting perhaps uncomfortably between the politicians and the protesters is General Ahmed Gaid Salah. Heeding the demonstrations, he originally forced Bouteflika's resignation and has himself been cited as a potential contender for office. But the protesters would rather otherwise.
The army must support and guarantee the democratic process in Algeria. That is to say, the democratic transition. It must support it. The army should never do politics.
Yet with the military not having shown a decisive hand, opposition members believe the government and an entrenched elite are simply buying time, hoping that they will run out of momentum. With no elections in sight, will the old guard prevail, or are the demonstrations still building? For their part, the protesters are adamant that they will persist.
This popular wave would have made any government in the world step down. But here, our government is dead. So we simply have to keep going. We will not stop.
Adam Pletz, The Newsmakers.
Let's go to our panel now. Amel Boubacar joins us from Algiers. She's a French-Algerian researcher and author of What Happened to the Islamists. In Montreal is Raouf Farah. He's the coordinator of the Algerian opposition group Engaged Youth Collective. And in Brussels, we have Andrew Leibovich, who's a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Good to have you all on the program. Amel Boubacar, let me start with you. The fact that this Constitutional Council cancelled or postponed those elections that were due very soon, does that mean that they're listening to the protesters? Are you encouraged?
No, absolutely not. These dynamics are totally disconnected. from the start, the priority of the people in the streets were not linked to new elections. It's linked to new institutions, a new way to do politics, to reappropriate the citizenship and state of law. It's also a way actually to reconduct and to reproduce the Algerian governance on the side of the army in order to elect a new president who will have all his powers in hand, with the army really ruling behind back doors. So the cancellation of the elections actually is only a step forward for the protesters in order to have a real negotiations, or to have real negotiations around a real genuine transition and direction of new transparent institutions. But that's not the end of the project of the mass movement, not at all.
Raouf, is Amel's skepticism and perhaps cynicism justified?
I think it's totally justified. In Algeria today, the popular movement is still very, very strong. Algerians are very motivated to continue to protest until to change the structural elements that composes the Algerian system. Algerians are not in the streets just to ask for elections. Elections is actually the top of the iceberg. Algerians are asking for a state, a democratic state, and the rule of law. So as long as the popular movement will continue to be so strong, so united, so mobilized, I think the system, or what the Algerians call usually the pouvoir, will continue to be pushed behind the wall until a real negotiation and transition process will start. But Algerians are also very clear. We are not engaging into dialogue before the concretization of some conditions. And one of the most conditions is the dismissals of the two Bs, what Algerians call the two Bs. So the president of the state, Ben Salah, but also the chief of the government. So a dialogue, yes, but not an open dialogue, a dialogue with some conditions that the civil society, but also political opposition, we would like to engage in.
Okay, so Raouf, Ben Saleh and Badawi have not been dismissed, but we've seen other people being dismissed. We've seen people come under corruption investigations. Don't you want to give these guys some credit to say that at least they're trying to get rid of some rotten apples?
Algerians are very, very skeptic with regards to this because, you know, in order to have an independent justice, this requires time. And for many of my of the Algerian citizens, this is just a settling of scores between clans, between groups of people, and this doesn't really relate to an independent justice. In order to have real justice, I think we should move forward into a transitional justice within the transition period, and then we can definitely leave the justice to work in peace and do its job.
Okay, so Andrew Leibovich, is that accurate that perhaps it's not quite the cronies and the fat cats that are facing justice right now? It's just some of the cronies and some of the fat cats and some of the big hitters getting rid of some of the other cronies and fat cats and big hitters and settling old scores with them. Is that what's happening?
I think it's certainly true that for Algerians, for many Algerians, they see it this way. And as long as Raouf was saying, as long as some members of these institutions that are seen as corrupt and having failed Algerians are still in place, any effort to dismantle other structures, even if it's well-founded, will be seen as at best incomplete because it's not removing the entire system. And again, as Raouf said, it leaves this idea that it's not just score settling, but that this is a kind of cover meant to satisfy people. But even if people might want that, it's still insufficient. And people are going to continue to look at these things with a very skeptical eye.
Andrew, even if it's a cover to satisfy people, even if the intentions were not as pure as they're suggesting they are, when it comes to the postponement of the elections, despite all of that, was it a good move to cancel and postpone those elections?
Well, I think it was certainly a move to show that the popular movement was not accepting any of the transitional proposals put forward. So it was more of a recognition from the government in place and a realization that this government-led transition wasn't acceptable and that these proposals had done nothing to sap the popular movement of its strength. So it was at least a recognition of that fact and a sign that the government slowly is understanding that these piecemeal proposals are just not acceptable and are not sufficient to people.
Rauf, when we talk about this issue being, well, it's an interim period, you need to give it time. I think the big question is, do all the protesters agree on what would be satisfactory enough for them to go home and to say, okay, I've done my job on the streets, now I can trust that the ball is rolling? Do they all agree on what those parameters are and what it would take for them to do that?
Of course not. Algerians, have different perspectives and views with regards to the transition period. Negotiations between civil society organizations, but also political opposition are undergoing. Algerians are discussing these issues in the street every Friday and every day of the week. So hopefully by a couple of weeks, we would agree at least on how to converge our visions and have a sort of, at minima, solution or proposal to start a negotiation period. That's what the civil society at least is hoping, with the organization of the National Conference on June 15th, with the purpose of gathering more than 500 people and more than 200 organizations, and to come with a unique document basically listing the different elements of this transition. Right. So Algerians are, they have very, very different opinions. Some are for the Constitutional Assembly, others are for a very short period of transitions. Some are suggest to start with presidential elections, others are more keen to legislative elections, etc., etc. But I think above all, Algerians are capable of going of overcoming these challenges and come up with a unique solution, a unique proposal to start a negotiation process with the real institution that holds power, which is the army.
Right. Amel, just yesterday we spoke about Sudan, and we spoke about the fact that the Egyptians, the Saudis, and the Emiratis were possibly not too keen for Sudan to become democratic. They prefer maybe the stability of an army that's undemocratic rather than the potential chaos of democracy, right? And there's a similar argument with Algeria and a suggestion that there are too many countries with too much to lose if Algeria just becomes an open democracy. How much of that is in your mind and in the minds of the protesters, that outside powers might be meddling and trying to keep the power in power?
Well, it was very clear since the beginning of the protest movement that Algerians will be refusing any kind of foreign interference. They have said so repeatedly each Friday, being the Emirates, being Saudi Arabia, being France, or even the US. So that's a kind of consensus within the people who are protesting. But at the same time, we should not be naive, and we should understand the interest that mainly the US and France have in not getting the situation violent. So there's also a consensus between Washington and Paris that the army should not violently repress the protesters or have any kind of move against basic and minimum civil liberties. But at the same time, what is occurring within on the Algerian scene is also important. We should not be naive. It's a transition that is coming, and it will take time. And the end or the objective is not obviously only just democracy. Rauf was mentioning the differences that are occurring within the civil society movement. Actually, you have three dynamics that are currently taking place. As I said, the army, who is trying to continue its business as usual by having a facade of a president or civilian president and leading from the back. The protest movements and average Algerians who are trying to make their voice heard and trying to get at a minimum consensus between themselves on what kind of society they want for tomorrow. And then you have civil society organizations, and each of these organizations is actually pursuing its own agenda. You have political parties and opposition parties who have been so delegitimized under Bouteflika, who are trying to put ahead the argument for upcoming presidential elections, because presidential elections is their raison d'être, if I can put it that way. They want presidential elections in order to survive. And then you have other NGOs and independent unions and so on who said, no, we want first a national constituent assembly in order to go through a new way to represent Algerians and to be able to have a new regulations, a new constitution that will make institutions more transparent, and that will make able for us not to have a new strong man again as the previous president Bouteflika.
And it really does inspire the next question, Andrew, that I guess one of the reasons why the Americans and the French and so on historically have always preferred a very simple, stable, strongman system because it's easy to understand. As the months have tumbled along and the Algerian protest movement has grown and we're seeing people still on the streets, what would they be thinking now from the former colonial power, France, from the Americans, other Europeans? Who would they be wanting to back, or is it nebulous? Is it unclear about who they can possibly back as they try and hedge their bets?
Well, I do think it's nebulous, and I can't speak for what might be going on behind closed doors in the French system in particular. But I know that at least from the beginning of this, the protest, France and the U.S. to a certain extent have tried to walk a very difficult balance where they don't want to be seen as supporting one side or the other. They don't want to be seen as taking too strong a stance, aside from the fact that the United States and France in particular are very afraid of violence and very afraid of instability in Algeria. So I actually think to some extent they would be happy to accept any solution that would seem to pacify protesters and maintain stability, because really for many outside countries, their major concern in Algeria is just that it remains stable. And I think there's maybe less interest, or somewhat less interest, in how that stability takes shape, because the stability is the main goal.
Yeah, Amel Boubacar, it's been largely violence-free, and for many, especially after 2011 and so on with the Arab Spring, they were largely surprised by that. What's been the secret to that? The fact that this has been a peaceful revolution and an ongoing process without bloodshed?
Well, it's the whole long history of Algerians who have accumulated techniques of resistance, who have experienced how their demands for change, for political and economic change, have been actually hijacked by the regime and transformed by the regime in order to stay in power. But actually, the question you were asking about the lack of leadership or the possibility for the army to pick up a candidate within its own ranks, actually, it's an outcome of the crisis. It's an outcome of this frozen politics since the so-called civil war in Algeria in the 90s, that there's no possibility to have a successor to Bouteflika. Bouteflika was the perfect candidate because it was giving the impression and the feeling that the civil war has ended, and that we had a civilian governance at the top of the country, and that he will be able to provide a minimum with Algerian with a minimum of democratic tools, namely sham elections and multi-party politics. But the thing is that all that was only a facade, and it was the president was unable and even unwilling to actually share powers and to make a real genuine change in Algeria. So these blockages, this impossibility to find a successor, even within the ranks of the army, don't forget that there's no large consensus on Gaid Saleh within the ranks of the army, even on the need for the Algerian army to continue to intervene in politics, even in an informal way. So this crisis is also an outcome of of what has been occurring in Algeria for the past 30 years. And that's actually what the movement and the protest movements and protesters are trying to show, that this is the end of a political cycle, that it is now time to think about a new relationship between the citizen and its institutions, a new citizenship, a new relationship between the president and the army.
Really good to talk to all of you. Amel, Raouf and Andrew, thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers. Coming up on the Newsmakers, the US requests Julian Assange's extradition. Is the Wikileaks founder too sick to stand trial? And Egypt is accused of committing war crimes in the Sinai. Should foreign powers drop their support of President Sisi? Julian Assange's 7 years of refuge in an embassy ended with him in handcuffs. Now the race to extradite him from the UK is well and truly underway. Both Swedish prosecutors and the US government want him to face a range of charges, from rape to stealing classified secrets. But a UN human rights expert says the hacker may not be mentally fit to stand trial. So, will the founder of Wikileaks ever walk free? That debate in a moment, but first here's Melinda Nusifora.
As soon as Julian Assange was dragged from the Ecuadorian embassy in London 2 months ago, the clock started. From the day of his arrest, the United States had 60 days to submit an extradition request. The US Justice Department formally filed the paperwork last week, with 4 days to spare. He's facing 18 charges related to hacking and espionage accusations dating back to 2010, when WikiLeaks published classified US defense information disclosed by former soldier turned whistleblower Chelsea Manning.
Come on, fire!
One of the leaked videos showed an attack by US helicopters which killed dozens of civilians and 2 journalists in Iraq in 2007. Full details of the charges are expected to be outlined during a court hearing on Friday. Assange's lawyers haven't responded directly to the legal development, but 1 day after the extradition order was filed, WikiLeaks posted this video on YouTube.
There is a desire and a method being erected for the United States, principally, to engage in an extraterritorial land grab through the abuse of law, where it is attempting to apply its jurisdiction to all countries in the world, to reach into other countries and destroy their sovereignty by demanding that its laws apply to their territory.
It's an excerpt from a longer WikiLeaks video posted 4 years ago. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture met with Assange inside London's Belmarsh prison last month and also questioned whether he could receive a fair trial in the US.
I am seriously, gravely concerned that if this man were to be extradited to the United States, he would be exposed to a politicized show trial in grave violations of his human rights.
Years of dodging legal bullets has taken its toll on the 47-year-old. Earlier this week, Assange's father, John Shipton, and dissident Chinese artist Ai Weiwei visited the WikiLeaks founder in prison. Shipton confirmed his son has lost a lot of weight and is being treated for an undisclosed illness. His comments echo the concerns raised by the United Nations Special Rapporteur.
Mr. Assange shows all the symptoms of a person who has been exposed to psychological torture for a prolonged period of time.
So what's your nut for?
Media outlet Russia Today has released a video of Assange, which it says was filmed inside the maximum security UK prison. It shows him smiling and laughing with fellow inmates. The video hasn't been independently verified, but RT says it was filmed before he was admitted to the prison's medical ward. With extradition to the US now a real possibility and an investigation into rape accusations in Sweden continuing, Assange's supporters fear the man in this video is running out of hope. Melinda Nusafora, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from the Australian city of Hobart is Greg Barnes, a legal advisor to both Julian Assange and Wikileaks. And in Washington, D.C., we have activist Shannon Lee, who is a member of the Rape, Abuse and Incest National Network. I thank you both for joining us. Greg, let me start with you. So the U.S. presenting the evidence, detailing the charges, justifying the extradition attempt. Tell me why you think this is more about politics than justice.
Well, I think it's more about politics in this sense that the initial indictment, and I think the last time we spoke, was indicating a charge which had a maximum period of imprisonment of 5 years. We've now moved into the terrain of charges which haven't been used in the context of the media and journalists in modern American history. And furthermore, would seem to be charges which amount to an act of vengeance on the part of the United States security establishment against someone who has revealed some truth about what happened in Afghanistan and Iraq. And we note, of course, that these charges have not been laid against any of the other publishers and authors of material. For example, the Pentagon Papers back in 1971. This is unprecedented in modern times.
And Greg, in addition to the United States going after him based on their claim that he violated the U.S. Espionage Act, the Swedes reopening the investigation into sexual assault allegations. Do you see the two as part of the same campaign?
Well, I think there's no doubt it's part of the same campaign, and I say it for this reason. In relation to the Swedish matter, it wasn't a case that they had to wait and see because there might be new evidence. They waited for a month before deciding to seek to reopen one of those investigations. One can only assume that there was enormous pressure on the part of the United States for them to do that. And I think that the decision of the Swedish court recently, which indicated that there was no need for a further detention of Julian Assange, given that he is detained, indicated the overreach and the overzealousness of prosecutors in that particular matter.
Shannon Lee, are you swayed by any of these arguments that suggest that all of this is part of a coordinated, concerted campaign against Julian Assange?
I'm not. All of these allegations stem from 2010. This is an Australian citizen who's basically evaded the law in several different countries. Even the Prime Minister of Ecuador accused him of harassing the staff at the Ecuadorian embassy. So this isn't somebody that we're talking about. This is a nice and fuzzy gentleman. I agree with the judge who sentenced him to 50 weeks in prison and stated that he's been exploiting his privilege and position and basically evading the law.
Shannon,
in terms of his...
Certainly.
Yes.
Are you open to the idea that he might be guilty of one and innocent of the other, or are you probably more inclined to believe that the guy's guilty of both charges, both from the Swedish side and the American side?
I can really just speak to the allegations in regards to sexual assault in Sweden, and there are several women that came forward, and if he is so innocent, he should, go back and face the charges.
Yeah, Shannon, do you think that it's plausible that some arms were twisted for the Swedes to re-up this case now, as was suggested by Greg earlier on? They've dug it up now, conveniently at this particular time. Would you hang a question mark over that?
Not particularly. It really doesn't have any bearing on whether or not he did the crime. There is a case that basically has not reached its statute of limitations. They have until 2020 to bring charges, and just because he has been accused of committing a crime in another country does not mean that he should be able to skip out on charges from Sweden.
Greg Barnes, so again, I'll ask you a similar question to what I asked Shannon. It's totally plausible that, yes, Julian Assange did release this information in the public interest. He could be defined as a journalist and so on. But separately, he might have raped someone. He might have done something terrible in Sweden and he needs to face justice. Would you accept that?
Well, I don't think he's got any problem, and he's never said that he's got any problem in answering questions. and in clearing his name in respect of this matter, as he did in relation to the other sexual assault allegation. It's the process that's been followed. It's been a very early process that's been followed by the Swedes. They made the point in relation to one of the matters that they were content at the end of the day to go to the Ecuadorian embassy in London and interview him. For some bizarre reason, they didn't interview him in relation to the other matter. And then suddenly, with, we would say, some pressure coming onto them, they've decided to reopen this second matter. But he's never said that he's not prepared to use the expression face justice in relation to the matter. He has a justifiable fear that if he were extradited to Sweden, that the Swedes would hand him over to the United States. That's been his reason from day one.
Do you buy that, Shannon?
I really don't. And I can really only state the words from one of his alleged victims, Anna Arden, who came forward and said that she does not believe he has taken accountability or responsibility for what he's done, for any of the sexual misconduct. And I agree with that.
I want to look a little bit at the politics of this now, Greg, and look at perhaps Assange's intentions. Was he naive to think that the Ecuadorians were going to protect him forever and ever?
Look, I don't think so, and I don't think so for this reason. As a matter of international law, once a person has sought asylum and been granted asylum, then that asylum remains. It's not something that can be removed from a person without just cause, and there was certainly no just cause in these circumstances. I think what happened was that he got caught up in the internal politics. He didn't himself, but he's a victim of the internal politics of Ecuador. I'd say this, though, that you introduced me as, and I certainly have been done some legal work for him. I'm now moving into a role in Australia where we're seeking to run a campaign in Australia, which is to have the Australian government involve itself in this matter. And the reason I say that, and it is relevant to your question, and that is you have an Australian citizen who sought asylum, who was granted asylum, and then who suddenly finds that asylum is withdrawn for political convenience. And that should be of great alarm. It is of great alarm, I think, to a lot of Australians. And, I know on this program in the past, I've talked about the role that the Australian government could play if it wanted to play it in relation to the Assange case. And now, more than ever, that is required.
He seems to be unwell. At least that's what we're hearing from the lawyers. He couldn't make his court appearance. I mean, the question remains, is he unwell because, well, he's just not very healthy, or are they treating him badly? What do you think, Greg?
Look, his father, to whom I'm very close and with whom I spoke yesterday and today, visited him and gave a news conference afterwards, as did we, the Chinese artist. And I just repeat their words, that is that he has lost a considerable amount of weight. Certainly, he's had spent some time in the Belmarsh Prison Hospital. And of course, someone who has been detained inside without any access to natural light for 7 years, going into a tough prison environment, means that one's health is unlikely to improve rapidly. So his father has that concern, but did make the point that his health seems to be stabilising. He's remarkably resilient. But it ought to be of concern, I think, to most people. And as the UN rapporteur on torture said, the conditions that he's had to endure and the conditions he's currently enduring are really problematic.
Shannon, presumably you'd want him to be treated well and for his health to hold up so that he can face justice, whether in the United States or in Sweden.
Absolutely. And the latest reports that I've read were statements from his father, who stated that he was in stable condition and that he is prepping to move back into the general prison population. So it doesn't sound like that is a concern here.
Okay. Greg, I want to ask you a big picture question here, because the implications of the conspiracy are really vast if everybody has been swayed by the Americans and everybody has been in on the act, whether it's the Ecuadorians or the Brits or the Swedes. Is it really possible that the United States has gone to such an extent in order to get Assange back in America because they're out to get him for political revenge?
I don't think it's a conspiracy. I think, and I live in Australia, which is a nation which is been rightly criticised for being joined at the hip with the United States, and we know in this country the power that the United States exercises in relation to Australian citizens who get into trouble overseas. There's no doubt that the United States have been running a grand jury process for a long period of time at some considerable expense. There's no doubt that they have now thrown the book at him, and there's no doubt that they are laying charges which have in modern times not been laid against a journalist or member of the media or of anyone, for that matter, who's republished what would be regarded really as material that is in the public interest and in the public realm. And so you would have to say that there is a great deal of zeal and determination on the part of the United States to see Julian Assange in that jurisdiction. And you'd also have to say that if you look at the comments that have been made by American politicians over the past 10 years or 9 years, you would say that there is a great deal of resentment and a desire for revenge. Now, does that involve Sweden? I don't think it's a conspiracy to say that nations which are close to the United States are lent on continually. And as I say, we've certainly seen it in the context of Australia, and I don't think it's too much of a leap to say that that's the case in the case of Sweden. Now, the last thing I'd say to you is in relation to the United Kingdom, it does have a robust judiciary, independent judiciary. This case, I think, is a real test for the United Kingdom justice system, because it may be that the United States has overreached here in the way that it has dealt with the matter, but that's a matter for the courts.
Certainly, Greg, sorry to interrupt you, right? But if
that's all right.
If he does get extradited, why not roll the dice? Because what came out from WikiLeaks turned a lot of public opinion against the United States' military adventures in Afghanistan, in Iraq, especially that video, Collateral Murder. The embassy cables turned a lot of people against the government's policies in the Middle East and elsewhere. Why aren't you confident that the system is robust enough and fair enough for a jury to find him innocent? He's not going to be tried in Guantanamo Bay.
But he's going to be tried in Virginia. And John Kiriakou, who was also tried in Virginia and who knows about what it's like to be tried in Virginia if you are accused of leaking information concerning the security establishment in the United States, knows that you're very unlikely to be acquitted. And the reason you're unlikely to be acquitted because juries in Virginia, in that part of Virginia, are drawn almost exclusively from the local population, which is, of course, friends and relatives and ex-defence force and security state personnel. And again, I don't think I'm being alarmist about this. I think that there's a very common view that it would be highly unlikely he would get a fair trial. The United States has a robust legal system in some senses and in some ways and in some jurisdictions, but this is not one of them.
Greg Barnes and Shannon Lee, I thank you both for joining us on the Newsmakers. Human Rights Watch has accused Egyptian security forces of committing war crimes in North Sinai. And a warning, you may find some of the pictures during this discussion disturbing. The military launched an offensive against Daesh in the region in 2017, following a mosque attack that killed more than 300 people. But Human Rights Watch says Egyptian forces are also targeting civilians by carrying out kidnappings, torture and murders. The Speaker of the Egyptian Parliament dismissed the report as political. So are these incidents an unintended byproduct of a fight against terrorists, or is President Sisi overseeing crimes against humanity? Well, to discuss this, Ahmed bin Shamsi joins us from New York. He's Human Rights Watch's Communications Director for the Middle East and North Africa. And in London is founder of the UK Egyptian Association, Mustafa Ragab. Good to have you both on the program, gentlemen. Ahmed, is it abundantly clear to you that Egyptian security forces are committing possible crimes against humanity in the fight against Daesh in Sinai?
Well, they're certainly committing violations of the laws of war, some of which amount to war crimes. We have documented otherwise in another report that we released about a year ago that crimes against humanity were committed by the Egyptian forces, not in Sinai, but all throughout the Egyptian territory, because enforced disappearances and torture in detention centers were rampant, systematic, and widespread enough for us to qualify them as a potential crime against humanity. Unfortunately, the range of human rights violation by the Sisi regime is pretty wide.
Systematic. Just for the benefit of our viewers, explain why that word is so important from your perspective. Because yes, some bad things can happen in the fight against terrorists, but when you say systematic, you're saying that this is built into the entire approach, right?
Yes, but we're talking about two different things here. I answered your question about crimes against humanity, and my answer was that we determined that there was a potential crime against humanity committed in Egypt throughout, and I'm not talking about Sinai here. I'm talking about enforced disappearances and torture in detention centers inside Egypt. This is what is systematic. It's torture of detainees in detention centers throughout Egypt. I am not talking about Sinai. Sinai is a different story. It's a report that we just released about a week ago, in which we didn't speak about crimes against humanity, but rather mentioned violations of the laws of war, because it's an armed conflict there between the Egyptian army and extremist groups who are armed. And the violation that we have identified there is not less serious. It's a series of violations of laws of war, some of which amount to war crimes. Forgive me if I'm being picky and precise on legal terms, but I mean, Human Rights Watch would pay great attention to those details.
And this is important, and this is why we have you expand on it for us. Mustafa Ragab, so according to Human Rights Watch, in the fight against Daesh, you guys are possibly just tearing up the Geneva Conventions and doing terrible things in the fight against terrorists. Why?
Let me first say that what is maybe encouraging the Human Rights Watch and carrying on their campaign against Egypt is what's encouraging really is the authority in Egypt that pays a lot of attention to their reports. You are in a battleground there. Egypt is fighting a horrible guerrilla war against people who God knows where they're hiding and what they're doing, disguising themselves in clothes and woman clothes and just attacking the army and the authority everywhere. Egypt is losing one of their best men every day in fighting terrorism. And if you are in a battleground, you're taking a risk, and this risk will result some casualties. We are living a normal life in Egypt. Egypt have managed to stop what happened in Syria to happen in Egypt, have managed to stop what happened in Libya to happen in Egypt. Thank God for that. But the war is not over yet. There is a lot of terrorists who are coming from Syria and coming through the Libyan borders as well to Egypt, and the Egyptian army is standing for this. If you live in this area, or if you help to look after terrorists, or help to promote terrorism, or help to do any of the things, then you're taking a huge risk. When I'm talking to officers who've been injured in fighting against terrorism, and they will say to you that they were having a cup of tea with some people, and the following day they found them in the front line fighting them. So you don't really know where they're hiding and what they're doing and who are they. So if you are in the battleground, you're taking a huge risk. Yes, there will be casualties.
So let's get
there
a
will be
response from
casualties, but it doesn't mean that Egypt is going against civilians.
Okay, so Ahmed, the basic premise of what Mustafa Ragab is saying is that Human Rights Watch hasn't fully engaged with the context and difficulty of fighting this insurgency in the Sinai. Is that true?
Well, what Mr. Ragab is really saying is the same thing that all people who convey the narrative of the regime are saying, which is repeating the word terrorism, 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 and hope that this will blur the issue and that we will not look into details. So what, fighting terrorism justifies everything? Those fighting terrorists justify detaining children as young as 12 in dire conditions, in overcrowded cell without adequate food, clothing, clean water, or healthcare for children aged 12. Those fighting against terrorism justify killing people arbitrarily after they have been detained by militias that are not even regular armed forces. Does fighting terrorism justify, forcibly disappearing people and torturing them? I mean, it's not because you will repeat and everybody will repeat the word terrorism in a loop that we will stop thinking. Wars have laws. We're not saying that terrorism should not be fought. We are absolutely recognizing that there are armed extremist groups that pose a danger to the population. And by the way, we have documented violations committed by that same group too. In our same report, we have documented abduction, torture, and killing by members of Daesh in Sinai. But it is not because they do those things that the army has a license to do the same things. There are laws, even in war, and those laws have to be respected. Otherwise, it's a violation of the laws of war, or it's a war crime. That's what we're talking about. It's not because we hear terrorism that we should just blind ourselves and not think critically anymore. And by the way, I'm sorry, if you allow me, these tactics are not efficient at all in pushing back against terrorism. If anything, they feed the terrorism because they create even more injustice, and people will join terrorist groups because they are treated abusively like that.
Mustafa Ragab?
I dismiss all these allegations because terrorists in Egypt are using children, are using women, are using all kind of people. And if you have a child or underage working with terrorism, then he is vulnerable. And let me just say to you that Egypt is successful in war against terrorism. At least they have managed to keep them outside of the center of towns, and they are just at the borders. I'd like to see this Human Rights Watch doing the work properly in Palestine. Whatever they say to the Israeli, they just stick two fingers to them.
Well, they just
very,
kicked out
very
the
good
Human
in
Rights Watch guy. Mr. Ragab, we had him on the program. His visa was not renewed. We interviewed him. They kicked him out of the occupied territories because of the work that he was doing criticizing the Israeli government.
Simply, they can't do anything there because you know what the Israeli will do to them. That's why they focus on Egypt, because the authorities in Egypt.
But allow me to address one point here, Mr. Ragab. Allow me to address one point here, because he's mentioned that in the same report, he talks about the atrocities committed by Daesh. They behead people. They do all sorts of terrible things. We know that. It's beyond the remit of this program and the job of our interviewers, interview producers, to go and find a Daesh spokesman. We're never going to do that, right? People hold the Egyptian government to a higher standard, right? So Human Rights Watch is documenting all the stuff that Daesh is doing and all their alleged atrocities, but it's saying Egypt, as a nation state with laws, its own laws and its commitments to international law, is not living up to those in the fight against Daesh.
No.
They're holding you to account to make you better in a justifiable fight, in a righteous fight.
No. Let me tell you something. If you live around the battleground, it's better for you to move away. And this is what happened with the people during the 67 war in Port Said and Ismailia. They have moved and left the battleground and left the army to deal with it. But if you choose to keep on living there, you're taking a risk. And the terrorists, as I said to you, using children, using women, the Egyptian authorities are arresting people every day dressed in women clothes. So you're fighting a horrible war there against terrorism, and there will be casualties. So the best thing for people who live in these areas is to move away until this job is finished. This is a very, very difficult task, very, very difficult operation there. The army, do you agree with me? The army is losing one of the best people every day. Every day people getting killed there, and to defend their land, to defend their country. Why don't you stop the people coming to Egypt from Syria and Libya?
Okay, so let me ask Ahmed if that is
a
reasonable.
War.
Okay, it is a war, and it's terrible. And It is
a war.
I've been at the Rafah crossing, and I've seen the anxiety of the Egyptians, of Hamas on the other side, of the Israelis, etc., because Daesh is a presence and it's causing trouble in Sinai, right? So I know how bad it is. But Ahmed, a suggestion by Mustafa Ragab that the people should just leave until the war is over. Address that for me, finally, please.
I really don't see how that solves the issue of violations committed by the army. Again, Mr. Ragab is doing the same thing. He's not answering to specific points and accusations that we're making. He's repeating the word terrorism in a loop in fear that it will just blur the issue and blind you to whatever's happening on the ground. And then he resorts to whataboutism. Oh, why aren't they doing this in Palestine? What about Israel? Well, it suffices to look at our website. You see that we cover violations in Israel pretty widely. And as you reminded him, Imran, yes, our Palestine director and Israel director is being kicked out because he's been doing a great job. And by the way, Human Rights Watch coverage of other countries and Egypt 90 other countries to be specific, would be easy to see in Egypt if the Egyptian government didn't block our website. So that is also something that is happening to us in Egypt. And I can keep on going and give you more details about all the violations that are committed by the Egyptian army as much as by Daesh in Sinai. But I'm afraid Mr. Ragab will come back and not answer specific points I'm making, and again start talking about terrorism and terrorism and terrorism. That it's the French call that a dialogue de sourds.
The reason
I keep coming, we are in a war.
Briefly, yes. Okay. So I understand you're in a war. Let me ask you a direct question very finally. So Ahmed says that the Egyptian government has blocked the Human Rights Watch website in Egypt. Do you, at the very least, as somebody who has agreed to engage with this discussion, and I credit you for that, and I thank you for that, at the very least, do you agree that that's a stupid idea and that's wrong to block the Human Rights Watch website in Egypt?
No, you can call it a stupid idea, but I'll tell you, if I was in charge, I will block it until I finish with that war, because this is not helping me at all in fighting that war against terrorism. You're just making my job difficult. We are in a war. Come and talk to me about human rights when Egypt finished with this guerrilla war, with people who hiding in caves, hiding in houses, hiding everywhere. Then come and talk to me after we finish with that war about human rights.
We prefer to talk to you while there are credible allegations that terrible things are happening on the ground. This is our job. This is why we do what we do. Nevertheless, I'm out of time. Listen, I'd love to have you both back on the program again. Mustafa Ragab and Ahmed bin Shamsi. Thanks so much. That's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, we ask if India's approach to Kashmir is pushing people towards militancy. Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.